Unit 7, Module 32. We're going to start with memory. First, we need to begin with the stages of memory. Those three stages of memory are going to be sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And if I had to guess, most of you guys are pretty familiar with short-term memory and long-term memory, but maybe not so familiar with sensory memory. And we'll get to those in just a moment. So the definition of memory is the active mental system for receiving, encoding, storing, organizing, altering, and retrieving information. Now I know that sounds like a lot, but if you skip down to the bottom of this slide here, three memory processes: encoding, storing, and retrieving. Those are the three that we're going to focus on in Module 32. Encoding simply means changing information into a usable form. And that's what we do with our memories. We change this information into a usable form. Now, storage is exactly what you think it would be like. When we hold information in the memory system, when we store that information that we've just memorized, and then last, retrieving that information is simply locating and taking it out of the memory system. If we cannot encode, store, or retrieve information, then we have a breakdown in memory. Now, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model is the next slide, and this is just a simple illustration of the processes in which memory take place. First, it begins with sensory memory. Once we are able to encode, store, and retrieve sensory memory, it moves into short-term memory. Once there, if we are able to encode, store, and retrieve that information, then it moves into long-term. So sensory memory, we begin with that first, and sensory memory stores an exact copy of incoming information for simply a few seconds. Most of us don't even realize that we engage in sensory memory. It's normally unconscious, and it only takes a few seconds. Now, there are two types of sensory memory: iconic and echoic. Now think about iconic. So that's a memory that we have that we have because of our eyes. So iconic memory. It is a mental image or visual representation. And then echoic memory is something that we hear. So it's an auditory memory, and it stays for about 2 seconds. So if I say something and stop, you can still kind of hear my voice there for just a second. Okay, and so echoic memory lasts up to 2 seconds, whereas iconic memory is only about half a second. So if you look at something and close your eyes, you can still see it, but as soon as you close your eyes, it begins to dissipate or to leave. Now next we go to short-term memory, and everyone, I think, is going to be at least somewhat familiar with short-term memory. Now, in short-term memory, we have selective attention, which is focusing on a portion of sensory input. And we've talked about selective attention in the past. Now, short-term memory is also encoded phonetically, meaning that memories are encoded by sound, and it is sensitive to interference. We lose a memory when we're interrupted. So think about when you're trying to count something, and you have some turd in the background who's saying all these different numbers. Well, it's going to mess you up, right? So what they're doing is they're interfering with your ability to retain information in your short-term memory. Now, working memory is simply another term for short-term memory, and it is used for thinking and problem solving. Think of your working memory as like a mental scratch pad. For instance, when we do math in our head, a lot of us are going to actually kind of like write it on a chalkboard in our brains. And we're going to see those numbers and we're going to work with them. So that's our short-term memory is a working memory. Now, our long-term memory stores information relatively permanently. And again, our memories, the information that we come in contact, they begin as sensory memory. And then once we encode, store, and retrieve that information, it moves to short-term. And then, of course, once we encode, store, and retrieve that information on short-term, it moves to long-term. So our information that we retain in long-term memory is relatively permanent. We don't really know how much information someone can remember. It's almost limitless. And you can see on the third bullet there that we can store nearly limitless amounts of information. Long-term memory is stored on a basis of meaning and importance, and our memories are encoded on the basis of meaning. So our long-term memory, it's less likely. So short-term memory, we just recite something over and over and over again until we can retain it long enough, say for a test. And then once we've been able to write that information down, then we forget about it. And oftentimes it goes away because we didn't really encode and store that information properly. We just recited it long enough to where we could write it down real quick and then we forget about it. Well, long-term memory doesn't work that way. You have to be able to encode and store and be able to retrieve that information in your short term for it to move to long term.